Hello, in this video I'm going to give a brief introduction to neural tissue in the human body, also called nervous tissue. So nervous tissue is specialized for high-speed electrical and chemical communication. A lot of people don't realize that nervous tissue has a chemical component to it, but it does. Neurons in nervous tissue experience an electrical event which causes them to release a chemical called a neurotransmitter, which is used as a signal within nervous tissue. We're going to use nervous tissue for different things. We're going to use it to rapidly sense both our internal and external environment. So we use nervous tissue for vision, but we also use nervous tissue to detect our blood pressure in our carotid artery. We're going to use nervous tissue to process information. So we're going to find nervous tissue in places like the brain and spinal cord, where some information processing can occur. And we're also going to use nervous tissue to control our responses to the information that we are sensing and processing. For example, we're going to use nervous tissue to send signals to our skeletal muscles in order to control those. So where are we going to find nervous tissue in the body? Well, of course, it tends to be found in the brain and spinal cord. Those are the major places where you're going to find it. But we also find a large amount of nervous tissue in nerves. So nerves are bundles of nervous tissue that are going to run through our arms and legs and our torso, and they're being used to carry information to and from the brain and spinal cord. But we also find nervous tissue in our special sense organs, like our eye, ear, nose, mouth. And we also find nervous tissue embedded in other tissues. For example, we have nervous tissue in our skin, which helps us to detect things like pain and touch. So all three of these are showing you different examples of nervous tissue. Over here and on the left-hand side of the screen, up top we have an actual histological slide of nervous tissue from the spinal cord, and down below it is the artist's rendition. They look very similar. The very large cell that we see, that's called a neuron. And the neuron is the cell in the nervous tissue that's responsible for the high-speed electrical and chemical communication. Now, you can see these little darker splotches around the neuron, right? And they don't look like much of anything, but indeed they are very important, and they are cells. So those are the nuclei of another type of cell called neuroglial cells. And neuroglial cells are helper cells to neurons. It's their job to make sure that the physical and chemical components surrounding the neuron are perfect. They're there to make sure that everything is absolutely perfect for the neuron to function. And when they don't function properly, the neuron won't either. So they are very important despite their tiny size. So I'd say that's a pretty typical looking picture of nervous tissue from a portion of the spinal cord. Right? Very similar to that is in the upper right-hand corner here. In this case, we see 5 neurons, and all the little specks in the background are the neuroglial cells. Now, down below, this actually shows lots of different tissues. Right? We have some skeletal muscle tissue. We have a vein and an artery, which contain smooth muscle tissue and epithelial tissues and connective tissues. But what I'd like to point out here are the nerve fiber bundles. So I mentioned that we have these things called nerves that are running through like our torso and our arms and our legs. Right? And the nerve fibers look very different in a histological slide than what we would see like in the brain or spinal cord. And the reason for that requires us to talk a little bit about a neuron. So this is a typical shape for a neuron up top. Down below that yellow thing is one of several types of neuroglial cells. So we'll ignore that one for now. I want to talk about a typical neuron structure. Okay? So a neuron tends to have 3 important parts to it. The main body of the neuron, where we find the nucleus and the majority of its organelles, that main part is called the cell body. It's also called the soma. Soma means body. Coming off of the cell body, we tend to have tiny little branches. Those are called dendrites. and then one long branch, and that's called an axon. And the dendrites and the axon have different jobs. It's the job of the dendrites to bring a signal into that specific neuron, and it's the job of the axon to send the signal away from that particular neuron. So those different parts have different functions. The axon is going to experience a major electrical event called an action potential, and the action potential is going to cause the release of neurotransmitters, chemicals, at the end of the axon. And that's how a neuron is going to be able to communicate. Now, coming back to our histological slides, right, we can see axons on this neuron here. And over here, the axons are harder to identify. But coming back to this picture in the lower right-hand corner where we see our nerve fiber bundles, that doesn't look like much of anything. And the reason why is because what we're looking at there are cross sections through axons. Nerves are nothing but bundles of axons. So the nerves running through your arms right now, right? Those are just bundles of basically electrical wires called axons. And when you cut them in cross section, you're just looking at a tube within a tube. So it's slightly nondescript. Now, there are many types of neuroglial cells, and we're not going to talk about those at this point. But like I said, they're all supportive cells for the neurons. They clean up the environment around the neuron. They make sure there's enough water and sodium and that sort of thing. So they are very important supportive cells.